HP, attack, defense. Every time a number increases, something happens, but Deltarune doesn't really give us good insight into what these stats actually do. Have you ever looked at your dealmaker and wondered how big of a difference it's actually making? Especially considering one of the stats a lot of players won't ever engage with until the Knight or the Guardian fights where attacking is actually required. Let's dig into Deltarune's code once again and find out. Let's start with how Deltarune handles a player's normal fight menu attack. The process it begins once you've clicked fight and selected your target is referred to in the code as the attack press step, during which when a player hits their select button again after a little rectangle, which is called a bolt by the code, enters the target area, the bolt check function is run. Those first 3 calls are holdovers from an old, unused style of input for the attack timing minigame, where you would have had to use different buttons to time each character's attack individually. The single button version is the one that's used in game, and it looks like this. What this code does is assign a point value based on how close you get to the target. The point values look a little something like this, where directly landing the target gives a substantial bonus of 150 points, which you can think of as a crit or a perfect attack, and being within 1 or 2 frames still gives a sizable bonus of 120 and 110 points respectively. After that, you start to be penalized from the base 100. 2 points are deducted for every frame you miss the target by. So if you are 3 frames away from a perfect attack, you end up with 100 minus 2 points for every 3 frames, which is 6, leaving you at 94 points. 92 for 4 frames, 90 for 5 frames, and so on all the way down to 14 frames, which awards you with a measly 72 points. Anything 15 frames or beyond always rewards 0 points and would result in a miss, which isn't usually possible on this end of the target, as the game prevents you from inputting an attack from 15 frames away. But real quick, if this sort of in-depth analysis of Deltarune game mechanics and code interests you, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. It's the best way to support what I do and enabled me to create more videos of this type. They take a lot more time and effort fact-checking and researching than a typical theory video, so I really appreciate any support given for these sorts of projects. Back to the code. This diagram also secretly extends past the target, and that is how misses can occur. If you take a look at the top of the function here, close is the value that is used to determine how many frames off of the target you are, and if that isn't within 15 or -5 frames of the target, it stays at the default 99 value. If you let the bolt go past the target for 5 frames, the game grants you the full miss, and you'll deal 0 damage. But if you land within 4 frames, you'll still be awarded between 120 and 92 points. So what are these points used for, you might ask? 2 things. The first is they determine how much TP you are awarded. In most fights, you're awarded an amount of TP equal to 1/10 of the point value, which the wiki refers to as accuracy, with every attack that you make, and some fights like Jevil and all of the Darkness fights reduce that amount further. TP is an entirely different topic, but under the hood, it's actually not just a bar from 0 to 100%. It actually holds values between 0 and 250, so 150 points would yield 15 TP, which reflects as 6% on the bar. The second thing that the points are used for is as part of the player's attack damage calculation. You multiply your points value by however much attack stat you have, then divide that total by 20 to get your base damage. Then you take the monster's defense value, the defense value that you definitely learned and internalized by checking out the recruit screen and reading all that useful info, right? You take that defense, multiply it by 3, then subtract that from your base damage to get the total damage you deal the enemy. Simple, right? Let's walk through an example. Chris in Chapter 2 has a starting attack of 12. They can increase it up to 15 by defeating enemies with violence, but let's assume Chris has been nice so far. They've got the spooky sword equipped, which gives them an additional 2 attack, bringing them to 14. You could have the Devil's Tail or the Iron Shackle at this point, but Chris doesn't, so 14 is their final attack. They're fighting a Werewire who has 7 defense, as you can see right here on the recruit screen. Let's do some quick math. You crit on your bolt check, so you take your 14 attack and multiply it by 150 for 2100. Divided by 20 is 105. So 105 base damage minus Werewire's triple defense of 21 gives us 84 damage. Let's see if that's correct. No, that's not correct. Why isn't that correct? This isn't a bit. I wrote all that out before testing, and that's my testing footage, and it didn't line up. So now I have to dig through the code and find out why. And this is why. Do you see the difference? Here, look a little closer. The recruit numbers are just straight up lies, and Werewire isn't the only one. Here's Vera-Kun and Mousewheel and Swatchling. In fact, none of the Chapter 2 enemies have any defense value, and all of them just have a random stat for their defense in the recruit screen. Most of the Chapter 1 enemies don't either. A couple of bosses do, like Clover and K-Round and Jevil. Not King, though. Rabbik and Bloxer, and none of the Chapter 3 enemies have defense, none in Chapter 4. Alright, we're just removing defense from the calculation. This is completely irrelevant. Goodbye. The damage you deal an enemy, outside of certain boss encounters, is your accuracy points multiplied by your attack and divided by 20. Simple, easy. At 14 attack, when you crit, you will always deal 105 damage outside of cases where there is encounter-specific damage reduction, which is now also where the monster's defense stat is relegated because it is truly that niche. If you grab the Iron Shackle, that increases to 113, and then Jevel's Tail would bring it to 128, so a pretty substantial damage increase overall, about 22% damage increase from just a measly 3 attack points. Not too shabby. How about the other big damage dealer outside of our regular attacks, the trusty Night Killing Rudebuster? Just like with our attacks, the base damage comes from multiplying Susie's attack by a value, this time 11. Susie's tough, so she starts with 16 attack, with the Brave Axe that comes to 18. 18 times 11 is 198. But Susie's Rudebuster also incorporates her magic stat, which right now is just 1. Multiplied by 5 gives us 5, and then we add the 2 together for Rudebuster's base damage, with these stats, is 203. Let's check and hope that actually lines up this time. Oh, thank God. 203 damage is correct. Technically, the enemy's defense value should have been tripled and subtracted from this value as well, but, we went over that already. Now, this is only Rudebuster's base damage. There is a timing minigame to increase its damage just like with regular attacks. The bonus damage ranging from 10 at a minimum to 30 at a maximum damage. Before Chapter 3, this functionality was overly forgiving, by which I mean bugged. Chapter 3 made a change here, this lock damage variable, that prevents the player from spamming the bonus detection, to make it function as intended. If you press the select button on the frame the Rudebuster hits the enemy, you get the full 30 bonus damage. If you're one frame off, you get almost a full damage at 28. Then it drops to 22, 20, big drop again to 13, 11, and then finally 10 damage. Unlike with the basic attack, there isn't a stable padding. It's clear Toby wanted to give a large reward for being perfect or nearly perfect, and then have bands of bonuses close to each other, offering roughly equal bonuses, stepping their way down to the minimum bonus. So, if we get the maximum bonus damage, we should add 30 to 203 and get 233 damage. Perfect. This damage is added after the earlier calculations, which doesn't matter with this example, but it does matter for the Roaring Knight specific damage calculations, which I'll go over now because they're uniquely interesting. You might remember from my Code Secrets video that the Roaring Knight has a special form of damage reduction that diminishes as the fight goes on. The Roaring Knight starts off taking 80% less damage, with that percent going down by 1% every turn until it reaches 65%. In the code, it's expressed the opposite way. Characters deal 20% of their normal damage and then cap at 35%. This is applied after the calculations related to the points value and the enemy's non-existent defense, since the knight also has 0 defense, and before Chris's special damage multiplier against the knight, not that the order would have any effect on this case. Let's look at an example that dodges Chris's peculiarities. Let's say Ralsei is wielding his Ragger 2 and going on the offensive. With no prior violence, Ralsei's got 12 attack plus 5 from the Ragger 2, giving us 17 to work with. We crit for 150 points, times 17 attack is 2,550, divided by 20 gives us 127.5, which is rounded to 128 damage. The code rounds here at this step, so we have to round here now also. Then let's assume it's the very first turn of the fight, so we're dealing 80% less damage. Multiply 128 by 0.2 is 25.6, always rounded up here to 26, even if the result had been something like 25.1. Let's see how hard Ralsei actually hits. Perfect, 26 on the dot, so our math is mathing. But let's say we were using the earlier parts of our playthrough to try and speed up the kill a bit. How much of a difference would going for something like the Puppet Scarf for Ralsei make? The Ragger 2 gives 5 attack, the Puppet Scarf gives 10, so up to 22 attack. 150 times 22 is 3,300, divided by 20 gives us 165 on the dot, multiplied by 0.2 for the damage reduction gives us a whopping 33 exactly. Is 7 more damage worth giving up the deal maker? We'll have to look at how Rudebuster scales against the Knight to know for sure. The way that the Knight's damage reduction functions against Rudebuster is very interesting. If you take a look here, there's a step after the damage formula, which applies the reduction just like with normal attacks, but at an entirely different rate. After we handle Susie's magic and attack stats and ignore anything related to the monster's defense values, you can see that the amount of damage reduction is added to this 0.65 constant. This means that the number here in the formula ranges from 0.2 plus 0.65 to 0.35 plus 0.65. Which is 0.85 to 1. In reverse, this means that the Knight is only reducing Rudebuster's damage by 15% on the first turn, and isn't applying any damage resistance at all by turn 15. On top of that, this all occurs before the bonus damage from timing Rude Buster correctly. So even on turns where it's reduced by 15%, if you time your button press correctly, you'll still get that full flat 30 damage bonus. So, with a perfect button press, and Susie's highest stat equipment option at this point, not including the Dealmaker since we got the Puppet Scarf, and excluding the Devil's Knife because we have the Devil's Tail, are the Toxic Axe for 6 attack, Devil's Tail for 2 attack and 2 magic, and the Spike Band for plus 2 attack on top of Susie's base 18 attack and base 2 magic in Chapter 3 gives us 28 attack and 4 magic. If we plug those into the calculations, we get a base damage for Rude Buster of 328. And since it's hardly affected at all by the damage reduction on the first turn, the reduced base damage should be 279, and a perfectly timed hit adds 30 damage after the fact for a final damage of 309. That means we should only need 5 Rude Busters to deplete the knight's 1,460 hit points and end the fight. That doesn't sound right, does it? It's not, because there's one final step for Rude Buster to really put a damper on how awesome everything sounds. At the very end of everything, after that 30 damage is added, the knight cleaves the damage in 2, and we're left with 155 damage. This is why you always check your documentation. The common sense assumption would be that rounding out our answer, 154.5, would follow the rules we all learned in elementary school and always round 1/2 up to 1 instead of down to 0. However, GameMaker's built-in round function uses what it describes as bankers rounding, and instead rounds 1/2 to the nearest even number. So 154.5 rounds down to the nearest even, which is 154 on the first turn, scaling up to 179 in 15 turns. To 179, to 179, to 179 in 15 turns. I don't think I've ever had so much go wrong actively during the process of writing a script. This one took me out of it, and I straight up gave up and asked the lovely folks in the Underminers Discord for help. They sanity checked me on the fact that the damage should be 179, and graciously tested it in their own clients. And lo and behold, when they tested, they did get 179. A classic, it works on my client debugging response. So what did we figure out? It's time to dig into a classic programming pitfall for newbie developers, and a pitfall that I saw coming and thought that I checked and double checked for, and still it caught me out. Floating point precision errors. You might have heard of these before. The most famous example of floating point precision errors getting out of hand that I'm aware of are in some of the OG versions of Minecraft. The Varlands are a conglomerate of map generation errors that are caused by integer overflows, not precision errors, but accompanying them are a number of floating point precision errors that cause this jittery camera movement and offsets to block detection and selection, like I'm showing on screen now. If you want a fuller explanation of what a floating point number actually is, you can refer to this computer file video from 12 years ago featuring Tom Scott. But simply, floating point numbers are the default way that most programming languages handle decimals when not explicitly asked to handle them in a different way. This is because they are computationally cheaper than other methods of handling numbers that can be both extraordinarily large and infinitesimally small without running into errors like integer overflows. But that comes at the cost of some accuracy. See, if I set a variable equal to a float value of 0.35, in actuality, the computer is storing a value very, very close to, but not exactly 0.35. This is close enough for most practical purposes. It's in every way that matters equivalent to 0.35, but sometimes that tiny bit of inaccuracy can trip you up, especially if you are rounding these floating point values off into whole number integers, like Deltarune's damage calculation code does at regular intervals. So what is this error that we're running into here, and why didn't it occur for the friendly Underminer who helped me out? In this first line, both me and the Underminer end up with the same result, 328, since we are both using the same equipment and both fighting one of the 99.8% of enemies with 0 defense stat. The next is where it gets interesting. See, when I was testing, I went through the entire knight fight, which every turn adds the float value of 0.01 to the starting damage reduction float value of 0.2. Every turn, adding 0.01 adds just another minuscule heap of floating point inaccuracy to our total. If the developers had to have written their code in a language like C++, where these pitfalls are bound to cause issues for programmers, instead of GameMaker's own scripting language, this actually could have caused an issue here in the damage reduction accumulation step. See how messed up our 0.35 is here? What this number could actually be is something more like this, or like this. See how now we're comparing a number that's ever so slightly smaller than 0.35 to 0.35? If this were a strict comparison, it would actually accumulate a 16th turn of damage reduction fading, and we'd do 1% more damage on the 16th turn against the knight than intended. However, this is such a common source of floating point precision errors that GameMaker's GML uses a fuzzy comparison here, by default for floats, and accounts for that slight imprecision for you without you ever needing to know. When I saw this behavior, that's when I disregarded floating point precision as the issue here, but I missed where it was really causing the problem. See, now when we get back to that step where we added 0.65 to the damage reduction, that's where the issue is caused and where things diverge. In the Underminer's code, they simply set the damage reduction to 0.35, which really set it to 0.349999, so on. Some number very slightly smaller than 0.35. In actual gameplay, the accumulated floating point precision of repeatedly adding 0.01 results in 0.35, 0, 0, 0, 0, and so on, a number very slightly greater than 0.35. And since both are enclosed within the ceiling function that always rounds a number up, in the Underminer's case, we're multiplying 328 by 0.99999 and so on, which is less than 1, and so results in 327 point something, which rounds back up to 328. But in the normal gameplay's case, we're multiplying 328 by 1.000 and so on, which is greater than 1, and so results in 328 point something, which rounds all the way up to 329. And now 329 plus 30 is 359, divided by 2 is 179.5, rounded to the nearest even is 180. And that is how we end up dealing 180 damage to the knight with a full power Rude Buster. This was really supposed to be a simple video. What was the point of all of this? Oh yeah, the deal maker. Let's slap it on instead of the spike band and see how the numbers look. 26 attack and 9 magic gets us 331 base damage, 282 with a resistance, plus 30 for a perfect hit, divided by 2 gives us 156 damage. And when damage reduction is at its lowest, 181 damage. So the Dealmaker gives you a lot less damage than the Puppet Scarf would. Even if Rousei goes down in the first few turns, it'd take a fair few Rude Busters to outdo the extra damage from the Puppet Scarf. But does either one actually make a difference? Probably not. It takes some pretty specific scenarios for either one to be the difference maker between ending the night fight after 9 versus 10 turns. With 1,460 HP to chew through, the biggest difference makers are going to be whether you can Rude Buster every turn, and whether you can get a bonus 28 or 30 base damage on each one. But the Dealmaker gets you extra money and protects you from Puppet Cat attacks, which will have to be a topic of a future video alongside the Shadow Mantle, but it gives you 5 extra defense. But what does that mean, and how much of an impact does that defense make? Is it a higher impact than the attack? Let's dig into that next. Finally on to the player's defense, which I really thought was going to be the longer section of the video, but after working our way through attack, I suspect that's no longer the case. The way defense works in Chapter 1 is identical to the way it works for enemies, assuming enemies actually use defense. When a character is going to take damage, you subtract 3 times that character's defense value from the damage that was going to be dealt. The base damage in most cases comes from the enemy's attack stat. Don't bother looking at the recruit screen for it, the attack stats are fake too. For these basic ones, you can take the enemy's attack stat, multiply it by 5, and that becomes the attack's base damage. Sometimes that number changes slightly. For example, Jevil's attacks that hit all 3 party members multiply his attack value by 4 to make the spread damage a little less punishing, and his Devil's Knife attacks multiply his attack by 6 to make them more deadly. Other attacks have been very specifically tuned to have an exact base damage value that are separated completely from the enemy's attack stats, like these attacks from the Roaring Knight. The Deltarune wiki, the good one, has a great breakdown of the base damage of all of the Knight's attacks. In all cases, whether the base damage is set manually or derived from the monster's attack stat, that damage simply has 3 times the party member's defense stat subtracted from it at the end, and ignoring any elemental resistance that might have come into play or the 1/3 damage reduction from defending, the damage is dealt to the party member or party members targeted by the attack. Let's look at an example. Jevil has 10 attack. Let's assume Jevil is using one of the especially nasty Devil's Knife attacks, and so the base damage he's throwing at Chris is 60. There are only 3 items that have 2 defense on them to go around by the time we get to Jevil, and Rousei's our healer, so we want to make sure he's extra protected. So Chris is left with 2 Ember cards at 1 defense each on top of their base 2 defense, which stays the same through all of the chapters. All 3 party members have a base defense of 2, Noelle is the only exception with her single point of defense. That's 4 defense total, 4 times 3 is 12, taken out of 60 base damage, leaves us at 48 damage Chris is going to take. That means Rousei, sporting his extra cute combo of White Ribbon and Dice Brace, is only taking 42 damage. Now an extra 6 damage doesn't matter too much when Jevil is hitting you for 60, but if Chris had had that extra defense, they could survive an entire extra Devil's Knife hit, whereas Rousei's getting 2-shot no matter what happens, so it may be worth swapping those defense items around. But against enemies with low attack, like a Rudin with its pitiful 5 attack value, the base damage coming at the party is only 25. So now Rousei with 6 defense is only taking 7 damage, and Chris is taking 13. So against lots of small hits, defense really adds up. This is all solely applicable to Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, the developers evidently saw how swingy the defense stat was in its Chapter 1 incarnation and effectively nerfed its effects before the party members' defense stats started to climb in Chapter 2 and beyond. How they did this is a bit complicated, and to visualize it, it's helpful to stop thinking about the defense stat as one big number, but instead visualize it as a pile of individual defense points. In Chapter 2, let's say Chris and the Fun Gang just beat Spampton Neo and are walking through a queen's castle. They're worried about the defense for the upcoming queen fights, and since they already got the deal maker, they don't have to worry about all the cat puppet resist items anymore. So they're rocking a chainmail in their other slot for 3 defense, on top of deal maker's 5 and Chris's base defense of 2. That gives us a total of 10 defense. In Chapter 1, you'd expect that to remove 30 damage from any incoming attack, but in Chapter 2 and beyond, the calculation has changed. First, let's look at the enemy that's hitting us. It's a werewire with 8 attack, so the base damage threatening us is 8 times 5, 40 damage. The first thing we do is find 2 specific thresholds by using Chris's max HP. Let's assume Chris has been pretty violent so far, has accumulated 150 of the chapter's maximum 160 HP. The first threshold we need is 1/5 of Chris's max HP, so 150 divided by 5 is 30. The second is 1/8 of that HP. 150 by 8 is 18.75, and we don't round this one. Now remember our pile of defense points. One at a time, these are going to block damage from that incoming 40 damage. The first point takes off 3 damage, making the current total 37, with 9 defense points left to apply. The next one's 34, then 31. And now the damage coming at Chris is 28, with 6 defense points left in our pile. The 28 is lower than the first threshold we found earlier, 30. So now instead of subtracting 3 damage, each defense point will only remove 2. The next point puts us at 26, then 24, 22, 20, 18, and now we're lower than our second threshold, 18.75. So this final point of defense only takes off a measly 1 point of damage, leaving us at a final damage of 17. So as you can see, defense as a stat got a pretty hefty nerf in Chapter 2. Instead of the Chapter 1 behavior, which would have left us taking only 10 damage, defense in Chapter 2 starts to gradually become less and less effective against smaller and smaller hits, so we take an extra 7 damage from the process. You can see the code for this process here, where we go through this whole section of looping code once for each point of defense the character has. More max HP has a big impact on these thresholds as well. It's pretty much impossible to hit with acquirable defense values, with Chris's minimum HP of 120 in the chapter. And against big hits like the knight's 206 damage attacks, the maximum defense value of 13, 5 from Dealmaker, 5 from Tenetai, and 1 from Bounce Blade on top of the base 2, only takes off 39 damage. Even the largest possible first threshold is 56.4, and that's for a Violent Susie's Chapter 4 max HP of 282, which means for this whole defense nerf to even possibly come into play against attacks that strong, you'd have to reduce 206 damage all the way down to 56 and still have defense left over. That'd require 51 defense, so if you can somehow equip 10 deal makers, you can get there, but until that point, defense is giving the full 3 reduction for each of the knight's big damage attacks. And before you start asking about how the Shadow Mantle's reduction plays into this whole situation, it doesn't. Elemental resistances are all applied after the defense reduction, so no amount of Shadow Mantle or Cat Puppet resistance changes how defense works, but the reverse is true. More defense means less damage for the Shadow Mantle to cut down on. I'm throwing up some footage of some examples of what damage looks like at different attack and defense values. While I do so, let's summarize quickly. Because enemies largely across the board have 0 defense, most of the time a character will deal damage solely based on their attack stat and by how closely you land your attack bolt to the target. You take your attack stat, multiply it by the accuracy bonus as determined by this table, and divide the result by 20, and barring any special circumstances like the knight's damage resistance or the guardian's weakness to Slay Dark, that result is how much damage you'll be dealing to the enemy. Rootbuster has some general rounding weirdness, but overall is influenced largely by the attack stat and to a smaller degree the magic stat, and after all calculations a bonus of up to 30 damage is applied to the attack, with Chapter 3 and 4 giving a smaller bonus for being less accurate. For the player's defense, in Chapter 1 every point of defense simply subtracts 3 damage from every enemy attack, but in Chapter 2 this was changed to a threshold-based system where, once that attack is reduced below a certain percentage of a character's max HP, defense starts to reduce the damage by only 2 and eventually 1 point of damage per point of defense. This system largely only matters for small hits. The system tries to prevent high defense values from fully nullifying hits, and instead leaving some small hits to still damage for some significant amount of damage after all of the calculations. And that's pretty much it. I'm not sure if I ever have or ever will succeed at making a simple video, as just like many others, this one ballooned a bit out of control. If there's a mechanic you want dissected or something you feel is unclear, the easiest way to get my attention is to leave a YouTube comment, I read every single one, or join the Discord and ask in the video discussion channel. Thanks to all these Patreon and YouTube members who have joined and support this kind of stuff from me, and thank you all for watching.